Hey guys, what's up? Unrested back, and my voice is pretty much shot. First 2 weeks of school, a lot of loud voices to get kids in order. We had a couple fire drills and practice lockdowns and stuff like that. You're using a loud voice a lot, so my voice is pretty much gone. So forgive me if this video comes in low or I sound muffled. I'm doing the best I can with what voice I have left. Today I'm going to talk about Japan's most evil company known as TEPCO. 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 You can look it up. It's one of the people that provide electricity. I shouldn't say people, it's one of the institutes that supply electricity to part of Japan. And they are by far one of the most evil companies. And the reason I'm talking about them right now is what went down with them during the Fukushima 2011 earthquake. And we have the announcement of a mega quake coming up called the Nankai Trough mega quake that perhaps could hit Japan in the upcoming years. And it's such a large predicted quake that it will nearly swallow half of eastern Japan, whether that be through tsunami or just literally the earth opening up. And it's kind of scary to think about, especially when you're going to hear today about how poorly run this company was and how badly they affected Japan and are still affecting Japan to this day. Um, if you can't comprehend why, it's a nuclear power plant that supplies the electricity from TEPCO. And obviously, just like Chernobyl had a huge problem when it exploded, this was almost Japan's Chernobyl, or was the equivalent of Chernobyl in the way that it has affected that area of Japan. In the Fukushima area, there's still plenty of areas people still can't live because of how poorly handled TEPCO's plant was and how they lied to the government, they lied to the Japanese people. They pretty much screwed over everyone living in that area. And I think this is something that's kind of just swept under the rug by Japan. They don't talk about this much. In fact, there's even NDAs that a lot of the employees have been forced to sign if they want to keep their job. And I'm going to try and talk about as much as I can with just what I know went down during that time, what I saw going down at that time. Obviously, I was there for the earthquake. I've talked about it before that I was teaching at a small English school at the time, and we even felt aftershocks of that earthquake that registered as like a 6.1 out in Osaka. And we were like 2 hours by bullet train away from that area. It was quite a distance, and we were still feeling it. Um, the scariest thing about the TEPCO situation is it was a nuclear power plant, and the government had checked it back in 2009, all right, 2 years before there was any Fukushima earthquake. And they said, look, guys, we're investigating your situation here, and it does not look safe enough for an earthquake. There's a lot of specialties, foundation specialties, and structural integrity that it needs to be signed off on by the government to say your building is built to a specification in which it could easily take on an earthquake of magnitude. I think it's like up to 7.1 or 9.1, some very high level earthquakes. And any new buildings built after the Kobe earthquake, it was something, I can't remember the exact date of the Kobe one, but it was something 1996, I want to say that one happened. After that one happened, everybody had to follow these regulations, and TEPCO just wasn't up to par. And this was in 2009, a decade after this happened, and they still didn't have everything in order. And the government even said so. It said, you got to get a lot of stuff fixed up here. Your venting isn't right. You're using seawater to cool your plants, which you really shouldn't be doing because that affects the wildlife and the environment. And they just didn't listen. They just didn't care, I guess, or just kept falsifying all the reports. And, you know, it led to what we're about to talk about, all the disasters that went down after the earthquake. So 2011, the earthquake happens. And the first big problem right away is the fact that this screwed up how the power plant cooled down its nuclear, I don't know, what do you call them? The rods. I'm not, obviously not a science guy here, but You may have seen the Chernobyl documentary or movie, and you saw those rods popping up and down that started to get overheated during that one. There's a more modern version of that going on at TEPCO, and as those started to get hotter and hotter, what they were supposed to do was vent that area of their nuclear power plant to obviously let off all the heat and stop it from having a full nuclear meltdown. Well, at the time, the Prime Minister Khan called down there and was like, all right, let's go ahead and do this. I see you guys are about to have a nuclear meltdown, so let's vent it finally. And what they had never told the government or the Prime Minister was that even though they had installed all this venting stuff in case of a nuclear meltdown, they had never tried to do it. They had never had any emergency drills. They had never ever released their venting shafts and figured out if they could even physically do this. And now that they were at a critical point, they realized they weren't really sure how to do it safely or that they could do it at all. They had no mechanical way of doing it and no remote way of doing it. So, guess what they had to do? They had to choose people who were pretty much condemned as soon as they got into the area of these venting shafts. And when I say condemned, I mean as in they'll take on as much radiation that will shorten their life or even have drastic effects, having cancer come on, like early death because of how much radiation they're taking on. And supposedly they said, well, we figured out a way around that. We only let these teams go in there for 17 minutes at a time, and that's just enough time so that they don't get too much rads of radiation and they can safely do this. But apparently, they had to send in team after team after team for 17 minutes at a time, and they could only slightly turn these valves. So it would take over 9 minutes just to get into the area which these valves were at, and then they would turn these and somehow get out on time, which it doesn't make sense if you think about it. If it took 9 minutes to get in there, unless they turned the valves in 0 seconds, how did they get back out in time to be safe? It doesn't even make any sense. 9 minutes in would have to be another 9 minutes out, 18 minutes total. You're already over the limit, right? So these people were condemned, and a lot of them were like issued all these kind of like bravery rewards and stuff like that by the government. But what does that matter when you're condemned to die by the amount of radiation you took on for a selfish company that didn't even make sure they had a remote mechanical or safe way to vent their own nuclear meltdown? And we're not talking like ancient technology here. This thing was built in the 2000s. It was a fresh, new, supposedly under the documents needed for safety precaution, all that type of stuff for the government. Yet they were still having to manually vent their own stuff. It's just crazy. I mean, I don't know a ton about nuclear power plants, but I would imagine you would think, okay, radiation bad, me not want to go there, me do remotely, right? Like it's very simple idea. Yeah, I'm sure it was much more costly to install something that could remotely do that, but they didn't want to take the time or the money to do that. Instead, they'd rather risk their own employees' lives and condemn them to an early death to have to manually turn these valves. And on top of it, it just gets worse and worse. Like the actual prime minister at the time had to keep bugging them to do this. Like he would call and call and call and be like, why hasn't this shaft been vented yet? Why haven't these, nuclear power plants been vented yet? And it had to get to a point where he literally had to fly down there to the nuclear power plant, get out and talk to the site administrator and say, do this now. And finally, they were forced to do it because literally the entire, king of the country, the president, the prime minister had to come into his face and be like, what are you doing? Like, vent this. So it only gets worse from there. I'm sure you probably know about the water that washed up around the areas where nuclear radiation was leaking out. It polluted all the waters around there. It killed fish for miles and miles and miles. And I'm not talking about like a small radius of fish in the ocean. I'm talking dead fish were washing up in Alaska, all the way from Fukushima, that had radiation levels they could test that were super high because of how badly they had polluted the area. Um, After that, they said they were going to find all the seawater, which I don't even know how you would do that, and filter it for a few years until it was safe to put back into the ocean. And, recently in the last few years, they've done this. They've supposedly put all that water through filters and released it back into the ocean. And they said, we've tested it, super safe. Radiation levels so low it couldn't even harm a fish or a person or anybody. But I mean, they were lying to the government. They were lying to the prime minister. Who's to say they're not lying to, I don't know, the public? I don't know why we would trust this company whatsoever. Um, there's so much more that happened because of this. So first of all, the nuclear radiation polluted the whole area. It made it unlivable. Um, it displaced all the families that lived anywhere near the TEPCO power plant. It pretty much radiated the area that they had to all move out. Um, in turn, TEPCO was like, "Oh, we'll do aid and relief," and they built them these like simple third world country little looking shacks that they could live in. And they're like, now this is just temporary. We're going to reimburse you for the houses you lost and everything. Guys, it is 2024, getting close to 2025, and almost all of those families are still living in those crappy little third world log cabins. They have not been reimbursed. The TEPCO's just dragging their feet on it. They haven't done anything yet. And this happened back in 2011. So, I mean, this is insane that they can just keep getting away with this. Um, all right, so we got displaced families, we got condemned team to go turn off the valve. Um, this gets even more sickening. So, a lot of time, immigrants to Japan, which is a rare thing to have, Japan does not take on a lot of immigrants, have a lot of trouble finding work. It's difficult for some of the less well-off Asian countries that come over here, Vietnam, Philippines. They come over here, they're looking for work. And guess what? TEPCO had a great work program for them. I'm sure you've seen before in America the temporary work construction people can do where like a van pulls up and is like, hey guys, today we've got a work site. We can take 15 guys. You guys come on and we'll go ahead and drop you off at this work site and you can just do some menial labor and get paid for a day. Well, they offered this to those people coming into Japan as well. What they didn't tell them was they were going to be doing cleanup in radiated areas that would affect them with like cancerous levels of radiation. They were cleaning up stuff they shouldn't be touching. They weren't given proper biohazard gear or anything like that. They're just like, yeah, just pick up these pieces and throw them away. It was all like radiated, nuclear, not meltdown, but radiated pieces of trash, garbage, concrete, all this different, all different types of stuff that was ruined. These houses that were knocked down by the tsunami and then also radiated by the waters of the Fukushima disaster. And these people are just there being hired to clean this stuff up, not knowing that they're touching stuff that's going to shorten their life and radiate their body and give them cancer. And they're just like, oh, yeah, yeah, just do this. Don't worry about what the job is. Don't ask any questions. And they too had to sign an NDA, which it's ridiculous. The only reason these people talked about it is, most of them knew they were going to die. But how are you going to sue the dead? So they came out and talked about this and exposed what TEPCO had put them through without telling them. Even when I was there back in 2023 through 2022, we were still having warnings from TEPCO because they provided some of the power all the way down in Osaka that we needed to turn off our ACs, our air conditioners, to help Japan save money and stop putting a strain on the electric company. Because running your AC is a huge strain on poor TEPCO. And a lot of people just were like, whatever, dude. I pay my electric bill. I paid to have my AC installed. The summer in Japan is brutally hot. I'm long-term Floridian, and I can tell you the Florida summers do not compare to how insane hot the Japanese summers are. Why? The humidity in Japan is just like absolutely astronomical. It's insane. Like you can't go outside without feeling like you're breathing through a wet rag in the middle of the jungle. It's brutal. And not a lot of people listen to this, but you know who did? The hardcore nationalists, old people who are like, yes, sir, right away, sir. Like they've got this long, enduring love for their country, which there is nothing wrong with, of course. But they're the ones that want to listen to this and be like, okay, we got to do what the government says because that's the way it's always worked. They're very old school and traditional. Um, and they would turn their ACs off during the summertime. And guess what? uh, Elderly deaths skyrocketed. People were literally dying in their sleep from dehydration. And this is because they're listening to TEPCO's advice of, hey guys, come on, please turn that AC off. It's really a huge strain on our poor little power plant. We're trying to rebuild it after the Fukushima. And this is like 2022, 2023. They've had like 11 years to fix this problem, and they still haven't. It's ridiculous. They're dragging their feet on everything, dragging their feet on helping these displaced families, and dragging their feet on supplying proper electricity to people who need it. Let's, you know, ignore the AC part. What about some of the elderly care centers that have high level, medical equipment running on electricity? They would tell them to be like, well, okay, if you're going to run that, can you like turn off all the lights in the building and stuff like that? There was like literally convenies and grocery stores that would just like turn off all the lights on their food and stuff like that. And it felt weird. It felt like you were like walking into a haunted house sometimes when you'd go into these places. And you'd be like, we're still doing this 11 years after the disaster because you still haven't gotten your act together. It's insane. So, we want to at least end this by talking about some of the other weirder things that went on during this earthquake and why it's so scary that we've got this mega quake coming. So, if there really is going to be this Nankai mega quake, it's going to be massively devastating. Quite frankly, um, with Japan in the state that it's at, we're in an economic downturn. Things are not going well. The yen is in the garbage. It's anywhere between, I've seen it go fluctuate between 160 to 180 yen to the dollar, which is like it's you know cut in half since I've been there. Since I first moved there back in 2007, the quality, the value of the yen has been cut in half. Like things are not going good. People have not been getting raises for the past 30 years. Um, Tax is the highest it's ever been. It's at 10% and still rising, expected to go to 15 to 20% on everything, everything. Um, and now we're getting taxed for stupid stuff like nature preservation in cities like Osaka, where it's just like an urban nightmare. There is no nature in the deep heart of downtown Osaka. I don't know why we're having we already pay super high city tax, and now we're paying for nature preservation tax on top of that. Like I'll pay your school taxes. I have kids who went to school there. I'll pay your, city utility taxes, road taxes, stuff like that. Stuff makes sense. I don't understand paying a nature preserve tax that just got added in 2024. It's total BS. Um, and we're paying all this stuff. We're having higher and higher inflation on everything we're buying, and salaries aren't rising with it. And then in the next 50 years or so, the population on top of that is predicted to be cut in half. It has not stopped lowering every year. The birth rates keep going down lower and lower and lower. Um, Less and less people getting married, less and less people having families. If we have this earthquake after all of this, in the middle of this, while all this is happening, Japan will be reduced to the quality of like a third world country. It will be an extremely bankrupt, extremely poor um, country where it won't be on the same level that it was for years and years and years with like the highest economic GDPs around the world. It dropped below Germany last year. It's now fourth in the world. It used to be second for a very long time. During the 90s, it was so rich that even the yen was higher than the pound, if you can imagine that. It was crazy powerful, and that has all fallen away. And it's getting worse and worse. And the government doesn't really seem to be doing much about it, including the possibility of this mega quake. Is there any kind of safety being put into order for any kind of emergency this big? I mean, this is literally going to swallow half of eastern Japan. Like I'm talking all the way up from Hokkaido, all the way down to Kyushu. Look at that on a map and see how much that is. And it's right on the edge of like Osaka and stuff like that. Like it's like as if a kaiju took a giant bite out of the side of Japan. That's what's going to happen if we have this mega quake. Recovering from this would be nearly impossible. Economically, uh, you know, the mortality rate of it would be brutally difficult for Japan to recover from. And on top of it, we've got this evil electric company that's right in the wake of it. They haven't finished fixing anything yet from 2011, yet now we've got this mega quake predicted in the next couple of years. How much further are we going to let this company continue to be a disaster? Um, I don't have a great solution. I don't know a lot about nuclear energy, but I do think there is a point where the government may need to take control of something this deadly and this horribly run so that if this megaquake does happen, everybody's not exposed to this again. Um, I talked about this in my members video a little bit that during these times, earthquakes are just, they're a really crazy thing to go through. I experienced two while I was there. One when I first moved to Japan, and of course the 2011 one. I had small earthquakes in between, nothing massive like 5.1 or 3.1, which is, those are make your lights shake a little bit from the ceiling, and that's about it. The first one I ever experienced when I had first moved to Japan was pretty scary. It shook my whole apartment building. Stuff was falling off of balconies and things like that. It has a weird dizzying effect where like you feel like your brain is shaking around in your head. You also just feel like there's no way for things to be stable around you. Like I know they tell you to do stuff like get in a doorway, stand up and put yourself in the threshold of a door. Like you don't feel like standing up and moving around during this time. Just walking feels really weird. I like imagine the drunkest you've ever felt and but still being coherent. Like your feet, it's like your legs are drunk, but your mind is like panicking. That's kind of how it feels, I guess, is you're unstable, you can't walk right. People say you should try to get outside if you can so there's no debris falling on your head, but it's hard to walk to the door, when you're on like a trampoline that's being shaken, like that's how it feels. That's probably the scariest one I ever was in. I watched the light on my ceiling go back and forth. I felt stuff falling off of shelves and hitting the floor, things falling off the balconies outside. I'll never forget that. That was the most noticeable thing, was like listening to things fall off the veranda and the balcony sounded kind of like a landslide, but it was like man-made objects and not natural objects falling off the side of the verandas and balconies. Um, During the Fukushima one, I was working at the time, and it shook the whole building that I was working in. We had the kids get under their tables and stuff like that. And I remember thinking like, oh, that was a pretty decent quake. I wonder if it just affected us. And then of course, right away, we found the news that it had absolutely devastated Fukushima. And the stories that will always be recorded in my mind the most during that time, um, one kind of sad and one kind of shocking, um, was hearing about flygen. I've talked about this before, what flygen are. As a foreigner, you're called a gaijin. A flygen was someone who just decided to up and leave Japan during the time of the earthquake and pretty much kind of used and abused Japan to get back to their home country. There were some people who just decided they would have the embassy pay for their ticket home. There were people who would like borrow assets or stuff from Japanese families who barely had anything left because everything they had was destroyed by the earthquake. Of course, none of us have moved a whole house over to Japan, so a lot of gaijin are not like losing full houses like the Japanese are. And like I guess the worst stories I heard were gaijin trying to like hitchhike rides off of people who are on like their last tank of gas. And of course, like all gas stations are closed after a tsunami hits Fukushima. And the Japanese families were like nice enough to drive them out to the airport. And then that was it for them. They couldn't get back. They had to like, go walk miles to get a can of gas and stuff like that. And it's just like, I would check in on people's situation or like, check what their situation is in their own home country before saying like, look, I know you're down to almost nothing, but can you use that last little bit of nothing to help me? There's people who like cut out on jobs, just like suddenly left the job. in the middle because they decided, oh, Japan's dangerous, got earthquakes. I mean, you knew that going there. And if you survived, you were okay, you were safe, your business is still around that you're working for. Why would you suddenly quit? I mean, that'd be like me leaving Florida the first time a hurricane hits. That doesn't really make any sense. Um, a lot of boyfriends and girlfriends left behind because the Flygen just decided, I'm going to go home. This is too scary. Earthquake. Don't like it. I guess, you have every right to do that, but at the same time, to cut out on a natural disaster that you knew is part of the country's history for thousands of years. I'm not sure why, especially the ones that like just didn't endure any kind of tragedy. There is Japanese families who endured insane tragedy during this time. 20,000 people died during the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami. People don't understand just how devastating that tsunami was. Try to look at the area sometime. Go over and look at it. None of it's been rebuilt. How much got destroyed during the tsunami? There is like brutally sad stories of people's houses being annihilated by that tsunami, them coming back to try and search for any family members or anything left of their house, there being absolutely nothing there. And then the worst part about it, TEPCO comes back into the picture because they were having a meltdown that was starting to radiate the area. So while they're trying to search for their loved ones that have gone missing after the tsunami, they had to be evacuated because TEPCO refused to vent quick enough at their nuclear power plant. So like imagine that you just experienced the greatest shock of your life. Now you're experiencing the greatest sadness seeing your house be swept away. On top of that, the tragedy of losing family members that you don't know where they are right now because gosh, they probably got carried away by the ocean. And then while you're trying to endure all that, TEPCO says, "Hey, can you guys get out of here? We never figured out if we could vent this properly, so there's probably going to be a nuclear meltdown." Unbelievable, right? The other story that really stuck with me was, and like, you can believe this as much as you want or disbelieve this as much as you want. I talked a bit about this in my members video, but this always kind of like shocked me to a certain extent. Like I'm not a big paranormal believer. I like reading and learning about paranormal things, but I'm not a huge believer in like ghosts or spirits or stuff like that. To each their own as far as that's concerned. No disrespect if you are into all that stuff. But I remember multiple stories of taxi drivers being interviewed during that time where they had multiple clients who would, get picked up. It's very easy to get a taxi in Japan. Literally thousands and thousands of taxis driving up and down. Outside the very edges of Fukushima, people would flag them down, be like, "Hey, would you mind if we go out to the area in Fukushima where my house was? I just want to check the foundation and just kind of visit it, as a keepsake memory of the area I used to live in." And, the taxi drivers at this time, it had been approved finally for people to go back out to the Fukushima area. They'd be like, "Yeah, sure. I mean, it's going to be a little bit expensive, but, 50 bucks, I'll get you out there to Fukushima." And they'd pick these people up. They'd talk to them about what had happened, people they had lost, how many, you know, how many family members had disappeared, what kind of house they used to have before. And then they would arrive at the destination, at the foundation of what was left of their house. And the taxi driver would turn around and the person wouldn't be there anymore. And it wasn't just like one kooky, crazy taxi driver telling this story. There was multiple taxi drivers telling these stories. And these are not like, you know, hooky spooky, I'm a psychic, type of person telling these. These were just like old sort of weathered taxi drivers who, did not have time for BS, telling these stories straight up and being very serious about it. And like I said, I'm not a big believer in paranormal stories, but if I were to choose a story I had to believe in, it would be the stories these taxi drivers told about taking ghost clients out to the foundations of their house. A little spooky, a whole lot of sad, and just a very dark time for Japan when this happened. Um, you know, to this day, I always worry about my own family out there. It's one of the reasons I bought a house here in America so that I could evacuate them if I ever had to. But, who's to say they're going to be safe or okay if things ever go wrong there? Japan is pretty good with disaster relief, the actual government itself taking care of people. is actually pretty decent. They organize it pretty quickly, and the Japanese people, gather their wits about them very quickly and help each other. So that's a good thing. But, you know, I hope this earthquake never happens, this mega quake. Um, Very scary, very, very scary. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think. Um, have you heard anything about TEPCO before? Is this your first time hearing about it? Um, I wish there was more I could do to get the word out there about how evil TEPCO is. What a horrible company um, that didn't care about the deaths of many, that put so many people at risk. If I were to offer you um, one insight, a way to fully understand the devastation of the Fukushima earthquake, there's a Japanese movie called Wind Callers or Voices on the Wind. I forget exactly what it translates to in English, but it pretty much means like voices in the wind or calling on the wind or wind call or voices of the wind. Just type in Fukushima earthquake movie, voices of the wind. And it's this really devastating story, a true story about a girl who survived the Fukushima earthquake, the tsunami, and she was the only member of her family who survived. She's like a high schooler or a middle schooler, and she's got nothing anymore. Her house is gone. Her brother, her sister, her family, her mom, her dad, everybody's gone. And she's just left at the site of where her house used to be with nothing to hold on to. And like her mentality, the people she meets in that area who also lost everything, it's a hard watch. It is a tearjerker of a movie, but it will really let you fully understand um, just how devastating that quake was. Anyway, guys, I'm going to end it here. It's gone on pretty darn long. Members, I'm going to give you a shout out in the next video. If I start calling that out now, it's going to go very long. I got some new members too, so thank you for that. If you yourself want to become a member, it's $1.90 a month. Gets you 4 extra videos every month. And if you like what you saw today, if this spoke to you in any certain way, a subscription would help a ton. A like, a dislike, a comment, any interaction with the video helps the algorithm. Even if you just open up that comment section, hit an exclamation mark and press enter, that helps. So thank you so much for sticking with me, for watching, for new viewers, for people who've recently found my channel. My subscribers continue to go up, which blows my mind because I thought this was a dead channel. Thank you so much. Until next time, I've been Unrested, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.